5 nights in the desert of death. True story. 5 days, 5 nights. 40 people started the journey through the Sonora Desert, that vast expanse of sand and rock and death that stretches between Mexico and Arizona like a wound in the earth that refuses to heal. Only 37 made it to the other side. And the 3 who didn't make it, nobody ever found their bodies. Not the Border Patrol with their helicopters and thermal cameras. Not the humanitarian groups who comb the desert looking for the lost and the dying. Not the coyotes, the animal kind, who feast on the remains of those who fall. Nobody found them because there was nothing left to find. The desert had swallowed them whole, and I don't mean that as a metaphor. I mean it literally. The desert opened its mouth and consumed them body and soul, leaving behind not even bones for their families to bury. Because in the Sonora Desert, it's not the heat that kills you, though. The heat is a killer, make no mistake about that. It's not the dehydration, though. You can die of thirst in less than a day when the temperature climbs past 110 degrees and the air sucks the moisture from your body faster than you can possibly replace it. It's not the rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of rocks, waiting for an unwary foot to step too close. It's not the Border Patrol, though. Getting caught by them means everything you sacrificed, everything you risked, everything you left behind was for nothing. It's not even the narcos who sometimes use the same smuggling paths. We use men with dead eyes and automatic weapons who see migrants as witnesses to be silenced or merchandise to be sold. It's the things that walk in the darkness, the things that have been there since before humans set foot on this continent, since before the first people crossed the land bridge from Asia, since before anything with 2 legs walked upright under this merciless sun. The things our guide warned us never ever to look in the eye. My name is Rafael Mendoza Garcia. I'm 30 years old now, living in a small apartment on the east side of Houston, Texas, working construction jobs for cash under a name that isn't mine, sending money back to the village where I was born through a network of couriers and money changers who ask no questions and keep no records. I am telling you this story because someone needs to know the truth about what happens out there in that desert. Not the sanitized version you see on the evening news, the stories about heat exhaustion and tragic accidents that frame death as something natural, something inevitable, something that happens when desperate people make desperate choices in a hostile environment. I'm talking about the real stories. The ones that survivors whisper to each other in the backs of pickup trucks and the corners of safe houses, their voices low and trembling. Their eyes haunted by things they can never unsee, their hands shaking as they clutch rosaries and crosses, and whatever talismans they believe might keep the darkness at bay for one more night. The stories that make grown men weep and pray to God for the first time in their lives, that make them wake up screaming in the middle of the night, that follow them home across thousands of miles and crawl into their dreams and never ever let go, no matter how many years pass or how far they run or how hard they try to forget. I was 28 years old when I decided to cross. The decision did not come easily or quickly. It was the culmination of years of struggle, of watching everything I loved crumble away piece by piece until I was left standing in the ruins of my life with nothing but the clothes on my back and a debt that was going to get me killed. Back in my village in the mountains of Oaxaca, a small collection of adobe houses and tin-roofed shacks clinging to the side of a steep hillside like barnacles on a rock, life had never been easy. We were poor in the way that people in cities cannot truly understand poor, in a way that seeps into your bones and shapes every moment of every day. We grew corn and beans and squash on terraced fields that our ancestors had carved into the mountainside generations ago, fields so steep that you could stand on one and look down at the roof of your neighbor's house below. We raised chickens and pigs, and if we were lucky, a goat or 2 that provided milk for the children. We hauled water from a spring half a kilometer away because there were no pipes, no plumbing, no infrastructure of any kind. We lit our homes with candles and kerosene lamps because the electricity lines had never reached our village and probably never would. But despite the poverty, despite the backbreaking labor, despite the constant struggle just to survive, there was love in that village. There was community. There was the knowledge that your neighbors would help you when times were hard because you would do the same for them. And at the center of my world, holding everything together with her quiet strength and her gentle hands and her voice that could calm any storm, was my mother. Her name was Maria de la Luz, and she was the strongest person I've ever known. She raised me alone after my father left working the fields alongside the men taking in laundry and mending from the wealthier families in the town below, selling tamales and atole at the weekly market, doing whatever was necessary to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. She never complained, never showed weakness, never let me see the fear and exhaustion that must have haunted her every single day. Instead, she sang. While she cooked, while she washed clothes in the stream, while she worked in the fields with the sun beating down on her back, she sang the old songs that her mother had taught her, songs about love and loss and hope, and faith songs that seemed to make the world a little brighter just by existing. She was my everything, my mother, my father, my teacher, my protector, my best friend. When I was sick, she sat by my bedside and held my hand and told me stories until I fell asleep. When I was scared, she wrapped me in her arms and whispered that everything would be all right, that God was watching over us, that tomorrow would be better than today. When I was angry at the unfairness of our poverty, she reminded me that we had each other, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. She died 2 years before I made the decision to cross, and her death broke something inside me that has never fully healed. It started with a cough. Just a small thing, a tickle in her throat that made her clear her voice when she spoke. We thought nothing of it at first. Everyone coughs during the dry season when the dust from the fields hangs in the air like a brown fog, and the wind carries particles of earth into every corner of every house. But the cough grew worse. It deepened, became wet, and rattling began to produce flecks of blood that she tried to hide from me by turning away, when the spasms hit by pressing her hand over her mouth and swallowing whatever came up. By the time we realized something was seriously wrong, the sickness had spread to her lungs, had taken root there like an evil vine, wrapping around her organs and squeezing the life out of them. She was drowning slowly and terribly in fluid that her own body produced. I carried her down the mountain on my back, 3 hours of steep, treacherous trails, her arms wrapped around my neck, her breath coming in wet, labored gasps against my ear. The doctors in the city, in a clinic that smelled of disinfectant and despair, told us what she needed: antibiotics, steroids, a machine that could help her breathe while her lungs healed. They told us how much it would cost, and the number was so large it might as well have been $1 million. It was more money than our family had seen in generations, more money than the entire village could have raised if every person contributed every peso they had saved. I tried everything. I sold our pig, our chickens, the small plot of land that my grandfather had left to my mother. I borrowed from everyone who would lend to me, promising to pay them back with interest, knowing even as I made those promises that I might never be able to keep them. I even went to the church and begged the priest for help, prostrating myself before the altar and weeping like a child. But the church was poor too, and their charity fund had been emptied months ago by other desperate souls with other dying loved ones. In the end, it wasn't enough. Nothing I did was enough. I sat by her bed for 3 days at the end, in that small room that smelled of sickness and herbs and the lavender soap she had always used, holding her hand as it grew colder and weaker, watching her fade away piece by piece like a photograph left too long in the sun. The local curandera came and burned copal and sage, chanting prayers in a mixture of Spanish and Zapotec, calling on saints and spirits alike to intervene. But the saints weren't listening. Maybe they never had been. On the 3rd night, just before dawn, my mother opened her eyes and looked at me with a clarity that she hadn't had in days. She reached up with a trembling hand and touched my face, her fingers cold against my cheek. "Mijo," she whispered, "my beautiful boy, don't cry for me. I'm going to be with your father now. He has been waiting for me for so long. I wanted to tell her that my father was dead, that he had been dead for 21 years, that there was nothing waiting for her but darkness and silence and the cold embrace of the grave. But I couldn't speak. The words were trapped in my throat, choking me. She smiled, that gentle smile that had comforted me through every hardship of my childhood. Then she pressed something into my palm, something small and cool and metallic. "Take this," she said. "It belonged to my grandmother and her grandmother before her. It has been blessed by priests and curanderas for 4 generations. Wear it always. It will protect you." I looked down at the object in my hand. It was a small gold cross on a thin chain, worn smooth by decades of handling the figure of Christ barely visible on its surface. "Mama," I said, my voice breaking, "don't leave me. Please, I can't do this alone." "You are not alone, mijo. You are never alone. God is with you. And I will be watching over you always from wherever I go next." She closed her eyes. Her chest rose and fell one more time, and then she was gone. I don't remember the days that followed. They exist in my memory as a blur of grief and shock and the endless, mindless rituals of death. The washing of the body, the vigil through the night, the funeral mass in the small church with its crumbling adobe walls and its wooden saints with their faded paint. The procession to the cemetery where generations of our family lay buried on a hillside overlooking the valley. The thud of dirt on the coffin lid, each shovelful a hammer blow to my heart. When it was over, when the last mourners had departed and the last prayers had been said, I stood alone at my mother's grave and made a silent vow. I would make something of my life. I would escape this poverty that had killed her as surely as any disease. I would find a way to honor her memory, to prove that her sacrifices had not been in vain. But the world had other plans for me. My father had been gone since I was 7 years old, swallowed by the same desert I would eventually enter, chasing the same dream that would eventually pull me north. He left one morning before dawn when the sky was still dark and the stars were still visible, and the roosters hadn't yet begun their morning chorus. I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard him moving around the house, gathering his things, and I crept out of bed to watch him from the shadows of my doorway. He saw me. Of course he saw me. Fathers always see their children, even when those children think they're being clever and invisible. He didn't scold me for being awake. He just knelt down in front of me, his face level with mine, his calloused hands resting on my shoulders, his eyes full of something I was too young to understand. "I have to go away for a while, mijo," he said. "I'm going to the north to find work to send money back so we can have a better life. I'll be gone for a year, maybe 2, then I'll come home and everything will be different." I didn't want him to go. I clung to him, my small arms wrapped around his neck, my face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in his smell of wood smoke and sweat and the tobacco he liked to chew when he was working in the fields. But he gently pried me loose, held me at arm's length, and looked into my eyes with an intensity that I didn't understand then but understand perfectly now. "Listen to me, Rafael," he said. "This is important. In this life there are things that wear the faces of loved ones to trick you. They will sound like me. They will look like me. They might even know things that only I would know, memories that only we share. But they are not me. If I'm already gone, if I've crossed over to wherever we go when we die, anything that claims to be me is a liar, a dangerous liar. Never believe them, never answer them, never look at them. Promise me, mijo. Promise me you will remember this." I promised. I was 7 years old, and I didn't understand why he was telling me this, why his voice had dropped to a whisper, why his eyes kept darting toward the window, as if he expected to see something terrible looking back at him from the darkness outside. But I promised because he asked me to, because he was my father, and I loved him, and I would have promised him anything if it meant he would smile at me one more time before he left. He hugged me one last time, pressing his lips against my forehead, whispering a prayer I couldn't quite hear. Then he stood up, shouldered his pack, and walked out the door into the darkness. He didn't look back. I think he knew that if he looked back, he might not be able to leave at all. That was the last time I ever saw him. A month after he left, we received word through the network of migrants who passed through our village. A whispered message passed from mouth to mouth along hundreds of miles of roads and trails that he had been lost in the desert. Not caught by La Migra, the border patrol that haunted the dreams of everyone who had ever tried to cross. Not turned back at the border to try again another day. Not killed by narcos or robbers or any of the human predators who preyed on the desperate and the vulnerable, just lost, swallowed, vanished without a trace, as if the earth itself had opened up and consumed him. They never found his body. They never found any trace of him at all. No bones, no clothing, no belongings, nothing. It was as if he had never existed, as if he had been erased from the world completely. 21 years later, standing at my mother's grave with nothing left to my name but grief and memories, I finally understood the warning he had given me that night. But by then it was too late. The path that he had walked was about to become my path too. The desert that had swallowed him was waiting for me with open jaws. The debt was what finally drove me to it. It had started small, as these things always do. A few hundred pesos to cover my mother's funeral expenses, because even burying the dead costs money, and I had none left after the medical bills had consumed everything. The funeral home wanted payment in advance. The cemetery wanted payment for the plot. The priest wanted a donation for the mass. And I, standing in the ruins of my life with empty pockets and a broken heart, had nothing to give them. So I went to see Joaquin. Everyone in the region knew Joaquin, though most people tried very hard to pretend they didn't. He was a moneylender, a usurer, a man who made his living by extending credit to people who had nowhere else to turn, and then extracting repayment through whatever means necessary. He operated out of a cantina in the town at the bottom of the mountain, a dark, smoky place with a reputation for violence and vice that kept respectable people away. But for those of us with no other options, it was the only door left to knock on. He was a small man, Joaquin barely 5 feet tall, with a round face and small eyes that glittered like a rat's in the dim light of his office. He sat behind a desk covered with ledgers and papers, a calculating machine at his elbow, and he listened to my story with an expression of sympathy that never quite reached those glittering eyes. "Of course I can help you," he said when I finished. "That's what I'm here for, to help people in their time of need." He named a sum. It was enough to cover the funeral and leave a little left over for food and other necessities. The interest rate was outrageous, but I was in no position to negotiate. I signed the paper he put in front of me without reading it carefully, my hand shaking, my vision blurred by tears I was too proud to shed in front of this man. That was my first mistake. The months that followed were a slow descent into hell. I worked every job I could find, picking coffee on the plantations in the lowlands, hauling stone for construction projects in the city, loading trucks at the market, but no matter how hard I worked, I could never seem to get ahead of the debt. Every time I made a payment, Joaquin smiled and nodded and wrote the amount in his ledger. And every time his men came to collect the next payment, the number I owed had somehow grown larger, swollen by interest and fees and penalties that I didn't remember agreeing to. I went back to the paper I had signed, but the fine print was dense and confusing, written in legal language that might as well have been a foreign tongue. Somewhere in there, I was sure, were the clauses that were draining my life away, but I couldn't find them, couldn't understand them. Couldn't do anything but keep working and paying and watching the number grow. A year after I first borrowed from Joaquin, I owed him 5 times the original amount. That was when his men started coming to my door with more than just demands for payment. The first time they just talked. 2 of them, big men with flat eyes and hard faces, standing on my doorstep in the early morning darkness, explaining in calm, reasonable voices what happened to people who didn't pay their debts. They described things in detail, specific things, personal things, and they smiled the whole time they were talking. The second time they didn't talk, they just hit me. Methodically, professionally avoiding my face, but working over my ribs and kidneys with practiced efficiency. When they were done, they left me lying in the dirt outside my house, gasping for breath, tasting blood in the back of my throat. 1 month, one of them said. Joaquin says you have 1 month to come up with the money. All of it. He's tired of waiting. They didn't say what would happen if I failed. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what happened to people who crossed Joaquin. Some of them disappeared and were never seen again. Some of them were found in ravines or ditches with their throats cut. And some of them survived but wished they hadn't. I lay there in the dirt for a long time after they left, staring up at the stars, thinking about my mother and my father and the village where I had been born, thinking about the life I had imagined for myself, the future I had dreamed of, the promises I had made to my mother as she lay dying. And then I made a decision. I would go north. I would cross the desert like my father had tried to do 21 years before. I would find work in America, make money, pay off my debt, build a new life in a new land. Or I would die trying. At that point, death seemed like a reasonable alternative. I sold everything I owned. The wooden bed frame that my grandfather had carved with his own hands, covered with intricate flowers and birds that had watched over my sleep since childhood. The table where my mother had prepared every meal of my life. The chairs where we had sat in the evenings talking about everything and nothing while the stars came out one by one. The chest where she had kept her few precious possessions, a lace mantilla from her wedding day, a photograph of her parents, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. I sold it all. Every piece of furniture, every tool, every scrap of cloth, and every clay pot. I sold my clothes except for what I was wearing and one change for the journey. I even sold the small gold cross that my mother had pressed into my hand as she lay dying, that cross that had been in our family for 4 generations. That hurt the most. Parting with that cross felt like a betrayal of everything my mother had been, everything she had believed in, everything she had hoped for me. But I needed the money. And I told myself that she would understand, that she would want me to survive, that she would forgive me. I hope I was right. I hope she forgave me. I think about that cross sometimes in the small hours of the night when sleep won't come and the memories are too heavy to bear. I wonder who has it now. I wonder if they know its history, its meaning, the generations of love and faith that it represents. I wonder if it protects them the way it was supposed to protect me. All of it converted into a stack of bills that felt pathetically small when I held it in my hands. A lifetime of accumulation reduced to a thin bundle of paper that could be counted in seconds. I took that money to altar. The town appeared out of the desert like a mirage, a jumble of low buildings and dusty streets, shimmering in the heat of the afternoon sun. I had traveled for 3 days to reach it by bus and by pickup truck, and finally on foot, following directions that had been whispered to me by a cousin who had made the crossing years before and now lives somewhere in California, working in the fields that feed half of America. Altar was unlike any place I had ever seen. It existed for one purpose and one purpose only: to serve as the launching point for thousands of desperate migrants who passed through each year on their way north. Every street was lined with vendors selling the supplies we would need: black water jugs that wouldn't reflect sunlight, dark clothing to help us blend into the night, electrolyte packets to mix with our water-canned food, and energy bars and first aid kits. There were money changers and phone card sellers and men who offered to carry messages back to families who might never see their loved ones again. There were women selling rosaries and scapulars and prayer cards, offering blessings for a few pesos, promising protection from dangers both natural and supernatural. And everywhere there were images of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Her serene face looked down from billboards and shop windows, from the dashboards of cars and trucks, from the walls of houses and the facades of churches. She was the patron saint of Mexico, the protector of the hopeless, the mother of those who had no mother. And in this town, in this place of desperation and fear and last chances, she was worshipped with a fervor I had never seen before. The walls of every building were covered with photographs of her, her image repeated hundreds of times in frames of every size and material, gold and silver and wood and plastic, some elaborate and some simple, some brand new and some so old and faded that the colors had bled into each other until they were barely recognizable. Rosaries hung from doorknobs and rearview mirrors in the hands of old women who sat on street corners, praying for sons and daughters and husbands and wives who had gone north and never returned. Candles burned in windows, and on makeshift altars, casting dancing shadows across walls, painted the bright colors of Mexican tradition, turquoise and coral and yellow and pink, as if beauty could ward off the ugliness that awaited beyond the edge of town. The whole town existed to serve people like me, people who had nothing left to lose. People willing to gamble their lives on a 5-day walk through hell, because the alternative was a life not worth living. I found the cantina that my cousin had described, a low adobe building with a faded sign and windows so dirty you couldn't see inside. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke and something else, something darker, something that might have been despair, wafted out through the open door. I hesitated for a moment on the threshold, gathering my courage. Then I walked in. The man I'd come to see was sitting alone at a table in the back corner, nursing a beer that had long since gone warm and flat. They called him El Coyote, though that wasn't his real name. In this business, nobody used real names. Names were liabilities threads that could be pulled until they unraveled families and homes and all the soft, vulnerable places where a person could be hurt. He was around 50 years old, with skin the color and texture of leather that had been left out in the desert sun for decades. Deep lines were carved into his face, running from the corners of his eyes to his jaw, from his nose to the corners of his mouth, each one a testament to years spent walking through hell and somehow surviving. But the most striking feature of his face was the scar, a brutal line of pale raised tissue that ran from his left temple down across his cheek to the corner of his chin, as if someone had once tried to split his head in two with a machete and had very nearly succeeded. The scar pulled at the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent expression that might have been a smile or a grimace or something in between that had no name in any language I knew. His eyes were what I noticed most, though. They were the color of wet slate, flat and cold, and utterly devoid of warmth or compassion or any of the softer emotions that make human connection possible. When he looked at you, it was like being assessed by a butcher deciding which cut of meat you would make. There was no cruelty in that gaze, but there was no kindness either. Just calculation, just evaluation, just the cold arithmetic of survival that governed everything in this place, where life was cheap and death was always, always close at hand. "You want to cross?" he said when I approached his table. It wasn't a question. He had seen hundreds, maybe thousands of people like me walk through that door. He knew why we came. He knew what we wanted. He knew that we would agree to almost anything if it meant a chance at a new life on the other side of the desert. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and dry and very far away. "I want to cross." He studied me for a long moment, his slate-colored eyes moving slowly over my face, my hands, my worn work boots with their cracked soles and fraying laces. He was reading me the way a farmer reads the sky before a storm, looking for signs, evaluating probabilities, calculating whether I was worth the trouble of guiding through 5 days and nights of hell. "Do you believe in God?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected a smuggler, a criminal, a man who made his living trading in human desperation to care about my spiritual beliefs. "I don't know anymore," I admitted after a moment of thought. "I used to. When my mother was alive, we went to Mass every Sunday. I prayed every night before bed, kneeling on the cold floor of our house with my hands clasped and my eyes closed, talking to a God I believed was listening. But when she died slowly and painfully while I watched and could do nothing to help her, I stopped believing, or I stopped caring. I'm not sure which. El Coyote nodded slowly as if this was the answer he had expected. He took a long drink from his warm, flat beer, his eyes never leaving mine. "Good," he said. "The ones who believe too strongly, they think God will protect them. They take stupid risks, walking into danger without preparation or precaution, assuming that faith is a substitute for vigilance. They walk into situations that anyone with sense would avoid because they think an angel is watching over them, will catch them if they fall, will carry them to safety if they can't walk anymore. They die with prayers on their lips and surprise in their eyes, unable to understand why their God has abandoned them." He set down his beer and leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, his flat eyes boring into mine. "The ones who don't believe at all are just as dangerous, but in a different way. They think there's nothing out there but sand and sun and border patrol. They dismiss the warnings as superstition, as the fairy tales of ignorant peasants who don't understand the world. They're arrogant, convinced that their rational minds can overcome any obstacle, that there's nothing in this world that can't be explained by science and logic. They die with confusion on their faces, unable to comprehend what's killing them because it isn't anything their science ever prepared them for." He leaned back and picked up his beer again, swirling the flat liquid in the bottom of the glass. "It's the ones in the middle who survive," he said. "The ones who aren't sure what's waiting in the darkness, so they stay alert. They stay afraid. Fear keeps you alive in the desert, muchacho. Remember that. Fear is your friend. Fear will keep you moving when your body wants to give up. Fear will keep your eyes open when all you want to do is sleep. Fear will keep you from making the mistakes that get people killed." "What is waiting in the darkness?" I asked. El Coyote set down his beer and looked at me with those flat, cold eyes. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind them, something that might have been fear. "Pray you never find out," he said. "And if you do find out, pray you survive long enough to run." He named his price. It was enormous, far more than I had, more than I could possibly raise. But I had heard stories of people who paid half up front and half when they reached the other side, and I proposed this arrangement. He considered it for a long moment, tilting his head to one side, running his tongue over his teeth as he calculated risks and rewards. "Fine," he said at last. "Half now, half when you're standing on American soil with your feet on solid ground and the sun on your face. But understand this, if you don't make it, if you die out there or get caught by La Migra or fall behind and get left, I don't give refunds. The money you've already paid is mine regardless of what happens to you. And if you make it but don't pay the rest, I have friends on both sides of the border, friends who are very good at finding people who owe me money, friends who don't take excuses or sob stories or promises of future payment. Do you understand?" I understood. I handed over the cash and he counted it carefully, his lips moving silently as he tallied the bills before tucking it into a pocket inside his jacket. "Be at the warehouse on the east edge of town tomorrow night," he said. 3 a.m. Bring only what you can carry on your back. No phones with GPS, they'll get you caught faster than anything else. No bright colors, they'll get you seen from miles away. No loose clothing, it'll get caught on cacti and thorns and rocks and slow you down when you can least afford to be slow. And understand this above all else, once we begin, there is no turning back. If you fall behind, you will be left behind. If you cannot keep up, you will die. I am not a rescue service. I am not a charity. I am not your friend. I am a guide. I will show you the path. Walking it is your responsibility." I agreed. What choice did I have? I spent that night in a cheap room above a shop that sold funeral supplies, coffins and crosses, and wreaths of plastic flowers, headstones with blank spaces where names would be carved. It seemed appropriate somehow, sleeping above all that paraphernalia of death, waiting to begin a journey that might well end with me needing their services. I couldn't sleep despite my exhaustion. I lay on a thin mattress that smelled of other people's sweat and fear, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling into uneasy rest. Dogs barking in the distance, their voices sharp and anxious. Trucks rumbling past on the highway that led north toward the border, toward whatever waited on the other side. Somewhere nearby, a woman weeping, whether from grief or fear or something else entirely I couldn't tell and didn't want to know. I thought about my mother, about the way she used to sing while she worked in the kitchen, her voice rising and falling with the melodies of songs her own mother had taught her, songs about love and loss and hope and faith that seemed to make the world a little brighter just by existing, about the way she smelled of wood smoke and mesa and the lavender soap she made herself from flowers gathered in the hills above our village, about the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, which was often so often despite the hardness of her life and the sorrows she carried. I thought about my father, about his strong hands and his patient voice, and the way he used to carry me on his shoulders when I was small, pointing out constellations in the night sky and telling me their names and the stories behind them. About the warning he had given me the night he left, words I had carried with me for 21 years without truly understanding their meaning. About the promise I had made him, a promise to remember, to never believe, to never answer, to never look. I was about to walk the same path he had walked. I was about to enter the same desert that had swallowed him whole. And for the first time since I had made the decision to cross, I felt truly, deeply, terrifyingly afraid. The next night I made my way to the warehouse El Coyote had described. It was an abandoned feed storage facility on the eastern outskirts of town, a hulking mass of corrugated metal and crumbling concrete that loomed against the star-filled sky like a sleeping giant. Weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot, pushing up through the asphalt with the persistence of life in inhospitable places. The windows, those that hadn't been smashed by vandals or time, were covered with grime so thick that no light could penetrate. The smell of old grain and animal feed still lingered in the air even after all these years, mixed with sharper scents of rust and motor oil, and the unmistakable odor of human bodies packed too closely together for too long. Inside I found 40 souls waiting in the darkness. They were illuminated only by the flickering light of a few kerosene lanterns hung from nails in the support beams, casting dancing shadows that made the cavernous space seem even larger and more empty than it was. Families huddled together on blankets spread over the cold concrete floor, parents clutching children who were too young to understand where they were going and too exhausted to ask, their small faces slack with a weariness that no child should ever know. Young men like me sat alone against the walls trying to look braver than they felt, their eyes darting toward every sound from outside, every car engine, every dog bark, every voice raised in the distance. In one corner, a woman clutched a rosary to her chest with fingers that had gone white from the pressure of her grip, her lips moving in silent, ceaseless prayer, while her 2 daughters slept against her shoulders with the peaceful oblivion that only the very young can achieve in the face of danger. I found a spot near the back of the warehouse, away from the others, where I could watch everyone without being watched myself. Old habits from years of living on the margins, always keeping one eye on the door, always ready to run. The concrete was cold against my back despite the warmth of the night seeping through my thin jacket and into my bones, but I barely noticed. My mind was already in the desert, already walking those endless miles of sand and scrub and stone, already wondering if I would make it to the other side or if I would end up like my father, another nameless victim swallowed by the wilderness, mourned by no one, remembered by few, one more ghost among the thousands who haunted that cursed expanse of earth. A man settled down beside me, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had begun to protest after decades of hard physical labor. He was older than me, perhaps 50 or 55, with a face weathered by sun and wind and time until it looked like the bark of an ancient oak tree. Deep furrows ran across his forehead and around his eyes and his hair. What remained of it was more salt than pepper. His hands were enormous, calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who had spent his entire life working the earth, planting and harvesting, building and breaking, giving everything he had to land that would never truly belong to him. "I'm Jorge," he said, offering one of those massive hands, "from Michoacan." "Rafael," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, the handshake of a man who had nothing to prove but plenty of strength left to prove it with. "Oaxaca." "First crossing?" he asked. I nodded. "Me too, though I've lived close enough to this desert my whole life to know some of its secrets." He paused, looking around at the gathered migrants with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and recognition, as if he saw himself in every one of their desperate faces. "My grandmother was a curandera, a healer. She died when I was 20, but before she passed she told me things, stories about this place, about what lives out here." "What kind of stories?" Jorge was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper, barely audible, above the rustle of bodies shifting on blankets and the distant crying of a child who wouldn't be comforted. "Stories about spirits, things that were here before the Spanish came with their crosses and their guns, before the Aztecs built their pyramids and ripped the hearts from their sacrifices, before any human being set foot on this land. My grandmother called them the hungry ones. She said they feed on fear and desperation, on the energy that people like us give off when we're terrified and alone and far from everyone who loves us. She said the desert calls to them, and people like us, we're just food." I wanted to dismiss his words as superstition, the kind of folk tales that grandmothers told to frighten children into obedience. But something about the way he spoke, the flat certainty in his voice, the way his eyes kept darting toward the darkened corners of the warehouse, as if expecting to see something lurking there in the shadows, made it impossible to laugh off. "Do you believe that?" I asked. Jorge reached into his shirt and pulled out a small medallion on a leather cord. It was an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the silver worn smooth and almost featureless, by years of handling, of fingers rubbing its surface in moments of prayer or fear or desperate hope. "I believe there are things in this world that can't be explained by science or religion," he said. "Things that have been here longer than humans have and will be here long after we're gone, long after our cities have crumbled to dust and our languages have been forgotten. Whether they're spirits or demons or something else entirely, something that has no name in any tongue ever spoken, I don't know. But my grandmother had the gift. She could see things that others couldn't see, know things that others couldn't know. And she was afraid of this desert, terrified of it. She made me promise never to cross, never to enter this place for any reason." He looked down at the medallion in his hands, turning it over and over between his thick fingers, his expression unreadable. "I'm breaking that promise now. May God and my grandmother both forgive me for what necessity has driven me to do." Before I could respond, El Coyote arrived. He came through the warehouse door, flanked by 2 younger men, his lieutenants or enforcers, their faces hard and watchful under the flickering lamplight. El Coyote introduced them as Lobo and Cuervo, Wolf and Crow, though I suspected those were not their real names any more than El Coyote was his. Lobo was tall and thin, with the nervous, restless energy of a hunting dog, straining at its leash, his eyes constantly moving, scanning the crowd, assessing threats that might not even exist. Cuervo was shorter and stockier, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by an artist who didn't believe in soft edges or gentle curves. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their presence alone said everything that needed to be said. Follow the rules, do what you're told, or there will be consequences that you do not want to experience. El Coyote stood before us, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering lantern light, the pale tissue of his wound catching the glow and turning his visage into something almost demonic. He did not greet us. He did not offer words of comfort or encouragement or false hope. He simply spoke, his voice like gravel scraping against stone, each word falling into the silence like a hammer blow. "Listen carefully," he said, "because I will say this only once. I don't repeat myself and I don't answer questions. You will listen, you will remember, and you will obey. If you can't do those three things, leave now and find another way north." The warehouse fell silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Even the babies stopped crying, as if they could sense the importance of what was about to be said, the weight of the words that would determine whether they lived or died. "We leave in 2 hours. We will walk at night and rest during the day. The journey will take 5 nights if everything goes well. It rarely does, so prepare for 6 or 7. You will carry your own water, your own food, your own belongings. If you cannot carry it, leave it behind. If you fall behind, you will be left behind. This is not cruelty. This is survival. The desert does not wait for stragglers, and neither do I. Anyone who cannot accept this should leave now and find another way. I will not be responsible for people who cannot follow simple instructions." He paused, his slate-colored eyes moving across the crowd, making contact with each person individually, as if memorizing their faces for some unknowable purpose. "Now I will tell you the rules," he continued. "Break these rules and you will die. Follow them and you might survive. I make no promises. I've been doing this for 27 years, and I've learned that the only thing I can promise is that the desert will test you in ways you cannot imagine. Rule 1, do not talk unless it is absolutely necessary. Sound carries in the desert, especially at night when the air is still. The wrong ears might be listening, and I don't just mean border patrol. Rule 2, do not use lights of any kind. No flashlights, no phone screens, no matches, no lighters. We navigate by starlight and moonlight. Anything brighter will attract attention we do not want. Rule 3, stay together at all times. Do not wander off for any reason, not even to relieve yourself. If you need to piss or shit, tell someone and do it quickly within sight of the group. Never be alone in the darkness, never." He paused again, and something changed in his expression. The cold professionalism gave way to something else, something I hadn't expected to see on that hard, scarred face. It might have been fear. It might have been something deeper, something that went beyond fear into a kind of primal dread that transcended rational thought. "Rule 4, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This is the most important rule of all. Listen carefully, because your life may depend on remembering what I'm about to tell you." The silence in the warehouse was absolute now. No one breathed, no one moved. Even the shadows seemed to lean in, listening. "In the desert you will see things. You will hear things. Voices calling your name in the darkness. Figures moving just at the edge of your vision. Lights that appear and disappear without explanation. When this happens, and it will happen, I promise you it will happen, do not scream, do not run, and above all, do not look directly at whatever you see or hear. Keep your eyes down. Keep moving forward. Put one foot in front of the other and don't stop. If they speak to you, do not answer. If they call you by name, ignore them. If they appear in front of you, walk around them as if they aren't there. They cannot hurt you if you don't give them permission." A young man near the front of the crowd, barely out of his teens, with smooth cheeks and a cocky smile that spoke of a life that had not yet taught him humility or fear, let out a nervous laugh. "Talking about ghosts, old man," he said. "We're not children afraid of the dark." El Coyote turned to look at him. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a snake coiling before it strikes. The smile died on the young man's face, replaced by something that might have been the first real fear he had ever felt in his short, sheltered life. "You can choose not to believe," El Coyote said. His voice was soft now, almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he had shouted. "That is your right. But understand this, they believe in you, and they are very, very hungry." The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody laughed, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. In 27 years of guiding people through this desert, El Coyote continued, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the scar that bisected his face. I have seen things that would break your mind if I described them in detail. I have lost people to the heat, to the border patrol, to the cartels, to their own stupidity and stubbornness and refusal to listen to warnings. But the ones I remember most, the ones who haunt my dreams still after all these years, are the ones I lost to the darkness. He traced the length of his scar with his fingers slowly, deliberately, as if remembering the exact moment the wound had been inflicted. The ones who saw something they shouldn't have seen. The ones who answered when they shouldn't have answered. They didn't die like the others. Their bodies didn't fail them. Their hearts kept beating, their lungs kept breathing. But everything that made them human, everything that made them who they were, was gone. Eaten, consumed, hollowed out like a gourd, and left behind, still walking, still talking, but with nothing inside. Empty shells, bodies that moved and breathed but had nothing behind the eyes. Nothing at all. The woman with the rosary began to pray louder, her voice trembling, the beads clicking together as her hands shook. "Believe me or don't," El Coyote said. "I don't care. Your belief changes nothing. But when you see them, and you will see them, remember what I told you. Eyes down. Keep moving. Don't answer. Don't look. Because once you open that door, once you give them permission to enter, it can never be fully closed again. They will follow you. They will wait for you. They will hunt you for the rest of your days, however many or few those days might be." He looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering on the young man who had laughed. "And when they finally catch you, and they will catch you eventually, they always do, you will wish you had listened to the old man who talked about ghosts." We left the warehouse at 3 a.m, 40 souls slipping out into the darkness, like spirits abandoning the world of the living. The moon hung low on the western horizon, a thin crescent that provided barely enough light to see the person walking in front of you. The air was surprisingly cold, carrying the bite of the desert night that I had heard about but never experienced, and I pulled my thin jacket tighter around my shoulders, already regretting that I had not brought something warmer. The first hour was chaos. 40 people trying to walk in single file through scrubland and rocky terrain, stumbling over roots and stones they couldn't see in the darkness, bumping into each other, whispering curses and apologies in a dozen different accents and dialects. A child began to cry somewhere near the middle of the line, and his mother clamped a hand over his mouth with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, that noise could mean death out here. An old man at the back of the column wheezed with every step, his lungs protesting against the pace, each breath a rattling symphony of effort and pain. But gradually over the course of that first hour, we found our rhythm. El Coyote led the way at the front, his silhouette somehow always visible against the darkness, even when the stars were hidden by clouds, a fixed point that we could follow without thought or question. Lobo walked at the middle of the column, keeping the group together with whispered commands and occasional physical redirections, a hand on a shoulder here, a shove in the right direction there. Cuervo brought up the rear, his stone face, watching for stragglers with the patience of a predator, waiting for weak prey, and the rest of us walked, one foot in front of the other, into the unknown. The desert was different at night than I had imagined. In my mind, based on stories and photographs and the vague impressions of a lifetime spent nowhere near such places, I had pictured endless dunes of golden sand, like something from a movie about Arabia or North Africa. The reality was harsher and more varied, a landscape of rocks and scrub brush and thorny plants that seemed designed by a malevolent god specifically to impede human progress. The ground beneath our feet shifted constantly from sand to gravel to hard-packed earth to fields of sharp stones that threatened to turn ankles with every step. Cacti loomed in the darkness like sentinels, their spines catching the faint starlight, ready to punish anyone who strayed too close. But it was the silence that unsettled me most. In the wilderness near my village, even in the deepest hours of the night, there was always sound. Crickets singing their endless songs, owls hooting in the distance, the rustle of small animals moving through undergrowth, going about their nocturnal business. But here there was nothing. Just the crunch of our footsteps on sand and gravel, our breathing loud and labored in the stillness, the occasional whispered word that fell into the silence and was swallowed without echo. I mentioned this to Jorge, who had somehow ended up beside me in the column. He listened, his weathered face creased with concern that went beyond ordinary worry. "The animals know," he whispered back. "When something is hunting, the prey stays silent. They hide, they wait, they make themselves as small and invisible as possible, and pray that whatever is out there passes them by without noticing." "What's hunting?" Jorge didn't answer. He just touched the medallion hidden beneath his shirt and kept walking. The first night passed without incident, or at least without any incident that I could point to and name. But I felt something out there beyond the edge of our group keeping pace with us through the darkness. A presence that watched and waited and hungered for something it could not yet reach. I told myself it was my imagination, just exhausted nerves and the power of suggestion after El Coyote's warnings. But the feeling wouldn't go away no matter how firmly I told myself there was nothing to fear. When dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange and gold, El Coyote led us to our first hiding spot, a cluster of massive boulders arranged in a rough semicircle, creating a natural shelter that was almost invisible from any distance. The rocks were cool now, retaining the chill of the night, providing relief from the first rays of the sun that was already beginning its assault. El Coyote distributed water rations with the precision of a pharmacist measuring medicine, pouring exactly the same amount into each cup, ignoring pleas for more from those who had already emptied their personal supplies. 1 small cup per person. No exceptions, no negotiations, no appeals. The water was warm and tasted of the plastic container it had been stored in, but I drank it slowly, savoring every drop, knowing that it might be many hours before I tasted water again. "Sleep while you can," El Coyote ordered. "The heat will make rest impossible soon." Tonight we have a long way to go. I found a spot in the shade of the largest boulder, my back against the cool stone, and tried to close my eyes. But sleep wouldn't come, no matter how exhausted my body was. The moment the sun cleared the horizon, the temperature began to climb with terrifying speed, as if someone had opened the door to a furnace and left it gaping wide. Within an hour, the air was too hot to breathe comfortably. Within 2 hours, it felt like we were trapped inside an oven set to broil. The rocks around us, which had been cool and comfortable in the pre-dawn darkness, began to radiate heat like they had been pulled from a fire. The air shimmered and danced, creating mirages on the horizon, phantom lakes and ghostly cities that existed only in the tortured space between superheated sand and cloudless sky. I watched a woman reach toward one of these mirages, her hand extended as if she could touch the water that wasn't there, her cracked lips moving in a prayer or a plea. Around me, the first casualties of the heat began to show themselves. Cracked lips that bled when people tried to speak, leaving dark streaks on chins and hands that attracted flies. Blistered skin that wept clear fluid, especially on faces and necks and the exposed backs of hands that had been unprotected during the night's march. Eyes that had gone dull and unfocused, staring at nothing, seeing nothing, as if the people behind them had already begun to fade away. A man near me, someone whose name I never learned, suddenly gasped and clutched his foot in pain. His shoe had begun to come apart in the heat, the rubber sole softening and peeling away from the canvas upper like skin sloughing off a burn victim. The same thing was happening to his other shoe. Within hours, he would be walking barefoot on sand hot enough to cook meat. The woman with the rosary had stopped praying. She just sat with her back against a rock, her mouth hanging slightly open, her daughters pressed against her on either side as if trying to melt into her body and disappear. Her eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had already seen too much lost, too much endured, too much. By noon, when the sun was directly overhead and there was no escape from its fury, the heat had become genuinely unbearable. Even in the deepest shade, sweat poured from our bodies faster than we could possibly replace it. Several people vomited their stomachs, rebelling against the combination of heat and stress and fear and dehydration. One elderly woman lost consciousness entirely and had to be revived with precious water that we could not afford to spare, but could not afford not to use if we wanted her to survive. "This is hell," someone muttered nearby. "We're walking through actual hell." I didn't argue. I couldn't. There was no argument to be made. When the sun finally began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire and molten gold, El Coyote roused us from our heat-induced stupor. His scarred face was grim, more grim than it had been the night before, if such a thing was possible. "We survived the first day," he said. There was no celebration in his voice, no relief, only grim acknowledgement of a fact that might prove temporary. "Now comes the first true night. Stay close, stay silent, and remember what I told you. The things in this desert are more active after dark. They've had all day to grow hungry." As we prepared to move, I noticed that the desert had gone silent again. Not the ordinary silence of a wilderness settling into the cooler hours of evening, with animals emerging from burrows and dens where they had hidden from the killing heat. This was that heavy, oppressive silence I had noticed the night before, the silence of prey animals hiding from something they couldn't see, something they could only feel in the ancient parts of their brains that remembered what it meant to be hunted. The second night began much like the first, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Word had spread about El Coyote's warnings, and everyone was on edge, jumping at shadows, flinching at sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. I was walking near the middle of the column, my hand resting on the shoulder of the person ahead of me, using touch to navigate, when sight failed, when I felt it for the first time. A presence. Behind me and to the left. Not the person behind me in line. I could hear her breathing, feel her hand on my shoulder. Something else. Something that was watching from the darkness beyond our column of weary travelers, tracking my movements, with an intelligence that felt alien and predatory and utterly wrong. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glimpse my peripheral vision without obviously looking, and I saw it. A shape maybe 30 meters away, keeping pace with us through the scrubland. It was tall, far taller than any human being, with a silhouette that was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately process. Too thin, too angular, limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles, joints in places where no joints should be. A head that was too large for its body, elongated into a shape that reminded me of something, but my mind refused to make the connection, refused to process what I was seeing. I told myself it was a cactus, a rock formation, a trick of the exhausted mind making shapes out of shadows and fear. Then it moved, not walked, moved. Gliding across the sand without appearing to take steps, flowing like dark water over and around obstacles, closing the distance between us with an ease that made my stomach clench and my throat tighten with primal, unreasoning terror. I snapped my head forward, my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough to bruise. El Coyote's words echoed in my mind. "Do not run, do not scream, do not look." So I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, pretending I hadn't seen what I had seen, pretending my legs weren't shaking so badly that I could barely stay upright, pretending the cold sweat running down my back was just the chill of the desert night. The presence stayed with us for what felt like hours. I could feel it there, just beyond the edge of vision, pacing us, watching, waiting, hungry. I could feel its attention on me like the weight of a physical stare, like fingers pressing against my skull, trying to find a way in. And then, around 2 in the morning, El Coyote stopped. His hand went up, and the entire column froze in place. The silence was absolute. Even the children who had been whimpering quietly from exhaustion and fear went suddenly completely still. "Get down," El Coyote hissed. "Face down, eyes closed now." We obeyed without question, dropping to the ground like puppets whose strings had been cut. I pressed my face into the sand, feeling small stones dig into my cheeks and forehead, and squeezed my eyes shut so tightly that colored spots danced behind my lids. For a long moment nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ragged breathing of 40 terrified people trying desperately not to make a sound. Then I heard it. Footsteps, but not normal footsteps. These were heavy, dragging sounds, like something was pulling its feet across the ground rather than lifting them. A wet, scraping noise that made my skin crawl and my stomach heave with instinctive revulsion. Shh, shh, shh. The sound grew closer. Closer still. I could feel the vibrations through the ground beneath my body, could sense the displacement of air as something massive passed nearby. And then came the smell. It hit me like a physical blow, a stench so foul and alien that my stomach clenched and I had to clamp my teeth together to keep from vomiting. Rotting flesh, crushed flowers, sulfur sharp and acrid, and something else, something I had no name for, something that smelled like the absence of life itself. The footsteps stopped, right beside me. I could feel a presence looming over me, could sense something bending down, examining me the way a collector might examine a specimen pinned to a board. The temperature dropped suddenly, impossibly, as if all the heat had been sucked out of the air and replaced by a cold so intense it burned. Then the voice came. "Rafael." A whisper, dry and rasping like dead leaves scraping against stone, like bones grinding together in an open grave. "Rafael, look at me, son. Look at me." My heart stopped. My lungs stopped. Everything stopped. That voice. That voice was my father's voice, the father who had disappeared in this same desert 21 years ago. The father whose face I could barely remember, but whose voice had haunted my dreams for 2 decades. "You've come so far," the voice continued, warm and loving and impossible. "I'm so proud of you. I've been waiting here all these years, waiting for you to come find me. Just look at me. Let me see your face one more time." Tears leaked from my closed eyes, soaking into the sand beneath my face. Every cell in my body screamed at me to look up to see him one more time, to feel his arms around me, to hear him tell me that everything was going to be all right, that the nightmare was over, that we could finally be together again. But then I remembered. His words. The last thing he had ever told me 21 years ago in the darkness before dawn. "Anything that claims to be me is a liar." I clenched my jaw so hard I felt something crack. My fingernails dug into my palms, breaking skin, drawing blood that mixed with the sand beneath my hands. "My father is dead," I whispered through gritted teeth. "He died 21 years ago in this desert. You are not my father. You are a liar, and I will never look at you." For a moment there was silence. Complete, absolute silence, as if the entire desert was holding its breath. Then a sound erupted from above me, a growl of frustrated rage that shook the ground beneath my body, that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that vibrated through my bones and my organs and my very soul. It was not my father's voice anymore. It was something else, something ancient and hungry and filled with a hatred that transcended human understanding. "You will open the door," the voice hissed. All pretense of love and warmth gone, replaced by something cold and terrible. "Tonight or tomorrow or 10 years from now, the door is cracked. We can smell your soul through the gap. We are patient, we have forever, and one day you will look. Everyone looks eventually." Then the footsteps resumed moving away from me. Shh, shh, shh. Fainter and fainter until they were gone entirely. El Coyote's voice broke the silence. "Get up. Keep moving. We don't stop until dawn." I rose on shaking legs, my body trembling so badly I could barely stand. Around me, others were doing the same, many of them weeping openly, their faces streaked with tears that cut through the dust and grime. They had heard voices too, their mothers, Their children, their husbands and wives and lovers, they're dead. As we resumed our march, I looked down at my hands in the faint starlight. My palms were bleeding where my fingernails had broken the skin. 3 crescent-shaped wounds on each palm like stigmata, like the marks of crucifixion. The pain was distant, almost irrelevant, but it was real. It was proof that this was happening, that I was still alive, that I was still me. I looked back just for a moment against every warning, against every instinct, against every ounce of common sense I possessed. And I saw them. 3 figures standing on a ridge about 100 meters away, silhouetted against the stars. Impossibly tall, impossibly thin. Their shapes were wrong in ways that hurt to look at, proportions that defied human anatomy, angles that shouldn't exist in any creature born of natural processes. But the worst part was their heads. Not human heads, something else, elongated, angular, like the skulls of dogs or wolves, but stretched and twisted into something that was neither animal nor human, but something far, far worse. One of them turned to look at me. Its eyes were yellow, glowing, and in those eyes I saw intelligence, calculation, hunger, and something worse than all of those combined, recognition. The creature smiled, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of teeth that caught the starlight. "We see you, Rafael." The voice was in my head, not my ears, a whisper that bypassed sound entirely, speaking directly to something deep inside me. "We have marked you. The door is open now. And one day, not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but one day you will walk through it." I tore my gaze away and ran to catch up with the group, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode in my chest. El Coyote was waiting for me, his scarred face grim in the faint light. "You look back," he said. It wasn't a question. "Only for a moment. A moment is enough. They have seen you now. They know your face. They know the shape of your soul." He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the scar that ran down his face. Tonight was just the beginning. They won't stop now. Not until they have what they want. "What do they want?" El Coyote looked at me with those cold, flat eyes, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something that might have been pity. "You." The second day was a blur of heat and thirst and exhausted, half-waking nightmares. We sheltered in a shallow cave carved into the side of a hill, 40 bodies packed into a space meant for perhaps 10. The heat was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear and something else, a faint sulphurous tang that clung to our clothes and hair and skin, a reminder of what had happened in the night. Nobody spoke of what they had experienced in the darkness. El Coyote had forbidden it, and even without that prohibition, I think we all understood instinctively that some things are better left unacknowledged. To speak of them is to give them power. To name them is to invite them closer. The third day was worse. One person died, an elderly man whose heart gave out in the heat, and we buried him under a pile of stones because we had neither the tools nor the energy to dig a proper grave. The third night brought the whispers. They came from every direction, voices calling our names, dozens of them, hundreds of them, overlapping and echoing until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. And they used our own voices. I heard my own voice calling to me from the darkness, telling me to stop, to rest, to give up. I heard my mother's voice singing the lullabies of my childhood. I heard my father's voice again, still pretending to be the man he had never been. By dawn, we had lost 2 more people. A man who wandered off in the darkness, following a voice that called his name. A woman who simply sat down and refused to move, her eyes fixed on something none of us could see. We didn't go back for them. We couldn't, flexible. The desert had claimed them, and the desert did not return what it took. The 4th day, El Coyote gave me his grandfather's stone. We were sheltering in another cave, another tomb of rock and heat, and he sought me out where I sat alone, staring at nothing, trying not to think about the voices I had heard in the night. "You remind me of my son," he said. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to me. I looked up surprised and saw something in his face that I hadn't expected, grief old and weathered but still raw beneath the surface. Your son. He crossed this desert 15 years ago. I was guide and another group couldn't be with him. He was young, brave, foolish. El Coyote's hand moved to touch his scar. He looked when he shouldn't have looked. He answered when he shouldn't have answered. What happened to him? They found his body 3 days later. His eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them, like the ones the orbs take. He breathed for another week before his heart finally stopped. The doctors couldn't explain it. No injury, no illness. He just stopped. El Coyote reached into his shirt and pulled out a small object on a leather cord. A stone black and smooth about the size of a thumbnail with a hole bored through its center. This belonged to my grandfather. He called it an ojo de sombra, a shadow eye. It has been blessed by curanderos from a dozen traditions, soaked in sacred waters, carried through more crossings than I can count. I don't know if it has any real power, but I'm still here. My father lived to old age. My grandfather died in his bed, surrounded by family. He pressed it into my hand. It was warm, warmer than it should have been, and I could feel something pulsing through it like a heartbeat. Wear this tonight. They have marked you. They will come for you again. When they do hold this, focus on its warmth. Remember that you are not alone. Why me? I asked. You've guided hundreds of people through this desert. Why give this to me? Because you remind me of him, my son. The same stubbornness, the same refusal to surrender even when everything seems lost. He closed my fingers around the stone. Be stronger than he was. The fourth night was the longest yet. We walked through terrain that seemed designed to break us, steep hills and deep ravines, fields of rocks that shifted and slid beneath our feet. The moon was full, casting everything in pale silver light that made the shadows seem darker by comparison. Around midnight we encountered them again. Dozens of nightwalkers standing in a loose semicircle across our path. Their yellow eyes glowed in the darkness. Their dog-like skulls gleamed in the moonlight. El Coyote stepped forward alone. "We ask for passage," he said. "We mean no disrespect." The largest creature tilted its head, regarding him with those glowing eyes. "You have brought us a gift, the Hollow One." I looked back and saw Roberto, the quiet man from Honduras who had barely spoken throughout the journey, shuffling along at the back of our group. His eyes were empty. His mouth moved continuously, forming words I couldn't hear. On the second night, the orbs of fire had found us on the mountain of bones, that cursed place where 70 people had died in a single night 3 years before. They had descended on Roberto, and when they rose again, whatever had made him Roberto was gone. What remained was just a shell, walking and breathing, but utterly empty. "The Hollow One is yours," El Coyote said. "It was taken fairly." A young man named Diego, Roberto's friend, surged forward. "You can't just give him to them." El Coyote turned, and the look in his eyes stopped Diego cold. "Roberto is already gone. If we don't give them the shell, they'll take more of us." Diego looked at his friend, at the empty eyes, the slack face, the lips that never stopped moving. "I'm fine," Roberto whispered. "I'm fine. I'm fine." Diego turned away, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The largest nightwalker made a sound that might have been satisfaction. "The Hollow One will stay. The rest may pass. But know this, we have marked one among you. One day he will come to us." I felt those yellow eyes turn toward me, felt the weight of ancient attention settle on my shoulders. "The door is open, Rafael. It can never be fully closed." We walked through the gap they had created, passing within arm's length of creatures from nightmare. I kept my hand wrapped around the stone, focusing on its warmth. "We are patient," the voice said in my head. "We have forever." The fifth night was the final push. We were 38 survivors, 37 minds, and one empty shell that had been left on the mountain when we started. The Hollow Ones came for us at midnight. They emerged from the darkness like a tide of nightmares, hundreds of empty shells. All the people ever taken by this desert, their eyes vacant, their mouths forming words that had no meaning. They surrounded us before we could react, and leading them was Roberto. His empty eyes found mine across the distance. "I'm fine," he said, and then impossibly he smiled. "We're all fine here. Why don't you join us?" "Run," El Coyote commanded. "Run and don't stop until you reach the lights." We ran. I don't know how long we ran or how far. Time ceased to exist. There was only the pounding of my feet, the burning in my lungs, the desperate need to escape. Around me I heard screams. I heard people falling. I heard the hollow ones claiming their victims. But I didn't stop. I held the stone so tightly it cut into my palm, felt its warmth flare against my skin, and I ran. And then I saw them. Lights. Real lights. The lights of the American side growing brighter with every step. I ran faster. I collapsed on American soil as dawn broke over the mountains, my face pressed into sand that felt different, softer, warmer, alive. When I finally raised my head and counted survivors, there were only 15 of us left. 15 out of 40. El Coyote never crossed. I saw him standing at the edge of the darkness, his scarred face visible in the dawn light, his hand raised in farewell. Behind him 3 tall shapes waited. Then the sun rose fully and they were gone. 2 years have passed since that night. I live in Houston now in a small apartment on the east side of town. I work construction cash jobs sending money back to Mexico through channels that don't ask questions. I have a new name, new papers, a new life built on the ashes of the old one. But the desert never left me. I still wear El Coyote's stone around my neck. Its warmth comes and goes, flaring up at odd moments, usually in the darkest hours of the night, when the silence grows too heavy and the shadows seem too deep. Last month I received a package with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from a Mexican paper, a story about migrants found dead in the Sonora Desert. 15 bodies arranged in a circle, their eyes open, staring at nothing. Scrawled in the margin in handwriting I didn't recognize, "They're coming." I burned the clipping. But the message stayed with me, burned into my memory like a brand. 3 nights ago I woke at 3 a.m. to scratching at my window. I live on the 4th floor. There is no fire escape. There is no balcony. There's nothing outside that window but empty air and a 40-foot drop to the parking lot below. I didn't look. I pulled the covers over my head like a child clutched the stone until its warmth burned my palm and waited for dawn. When morning came, there was nothing at the window. No marks on the glass, no signs of disturbance, but on the windowsill, sitting in a small pile of sand that had no business being there, was a second stone, black, smooth, identical to the one around my neck. Last night I dreamed of my father again. But he wasn't calling me home this time. He was running beside me through an endless desert, his hand gripping mine, pulling me forward. "They are coming," he said. "They are always coming, but you don't face them alone." I woke to the sound of scratching at the window. The stone against my chest is burning hot. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the glass I can hear a voice, my father's voice. "Rafael, it's time to come home, son." The scratching grows louder. The door I opened in the desert 2 years ago is swinging wide, and dawn is still hours away.